What if some of the world's oldest buildings weren't built but discovered? Was history rewritten before we learned it? Follow me down the rabbit hole about Tartaria and the mud flood. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the rabbit hole. I'm your host, Danny. As always, it's just me and my dogs here. Um, and today we are talking about Tartaria and the mud flood. So this episode was harder to research than I anticipated, but I saw it on one of the many pages that I follow of people that are like that love conspiracies, and people share different things there and do different things, which is perfect for me with my podcast because I can learn about different theories about different things, right? Well, one person was like, what's your favorite conspiracy theory? And this one was like just like the first comment that I saw. I was like, oh, I've never heard of that. Let me do a whole episode on it. And then I was falling down the rabbit hole as I do every week for you all, and I was confused and like kind of all over the place, and it's this one's kind of a hard theory to follow. So just kind of like hold on with me as we try to make it through, because I'm going to try to make it make sense as much as possible, but it's a little confusing. So just like hang on. So Tartaria, or Tartari, or sometimes called the Great Tartari, was the name of like Central and Northern Asia from the Middle Ages to like the 20th century, potentially. Some also say that it was just that region, which I'll go into that region a little bit more, but some say it was the whole world as well. So, but this, like, if it was just this region, it was given this name and this region by the Europeans. The Europeans were like, yep, that's Tartaria. That's where they are. That's who they are. Because they didn't, apparently, like, the Europeans didn't really know much about what was going on in, like, Asia at the time. So they just gave it a name and called it what it was. So this is the area, if we're talking about just the region. We're talking about the whole world. Some people do believe this whole world. It depends. There's different levels to this theory. So some people believe the whole world is Tartaria. Some people it's just this region. So the region is from the Caspian Sea and the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. And it included the vast region of Siberia, Mongolia, parts of modern-day China, and sometimes Tibet, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. I think I'm saying that right. Southern Kyrgyzstan. I feel like I'm saying all these names really wrong, but there's like a bunch of just letters put together that don't make sense to me. I don't know. And Southwest Kazakhstan. That one seemed a little bit easier. During this time, Europe didn't have much information about this area. And the people were known as the Tartars, which refers to the Mongols and the Turkic people under Mongol rule that lived there. As knowledge of this region grew, the Europeans started to refer to the parts of Tartaria as like different regions. So Siberia was called Russian Tartary or Great Tartary. Crimean Khanate was Little Tartary. Manchuria was Chinese Tartary. And Western Central Asia was Independent Tartary. That again is if you're believing in just that Tartaria was just the region. There's also, like I said earlier, the theory that it was the whole world, it was like a one world government, basically. So let's kind of get into this theory. Because it started off as a theory like about Russia and its origins, but has become more of like an architectural theory than anything else. So that's kind of where like we're going with it, because Russia's come out and they're like, nope, that's wrong. And so everyone kind of like veered away from that. So I don't know. And that's where actually like the world being Tartaria makes more sense than just this region. But I'm trying to include everything. And like I said, this kind of it got really confusing at the beginning. it got more clarity towards the end. It was a little weird. This one's a little muddy for sure. That's funny because it's a mud flood. I didn't mean for that to be punny, but yeah. Anyway, so the theory first appeared in Anatoly Fomenko's series New Chronology, but was popularized by Nikolai Levashov. And for context, they do classify Levashov as an occultist. So just so you know, like, kind of who that guy is. And they kind of say, like, oh, he spread this because he was part of a cult. And he was like, I don't know. It was really weird the way the theory kind of got spread about the Russia part of the theory that I didn't really cover because I couldn't find much information about it. So Tartaria was presented as the real name for Russia in like Russian pseudoscience, which was known for its like nationalism. But since the theory has gained popularity, it has parted ways with like the Russian nationalist frame, and now it's more about the architecture, and it goes down kind of like a completely different rabbit hole. It's very strange how this theory has changed. So Tartarians were a race of technologically superior beings. This race is credited with like vast cities and infrastructure built worldwide. And again, like this is more the worldwide theory than just like the Russian theory. And like some of these buildings and infrastructures, they include the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and the White House, the pyramids of Giza, the Taj Mahal, the Great Wall of China, like on and on and on. I mean, there's a ridiculous amount of buildings. I just named a couple because I wanted to give you guys like an idea. But most of the buildings that are credited to the Tartarians are these like Beaux Art style architecture buildings. So, and when you think about this architectural style, think like symmetry, columns, stones, statues, and figures. Like the first floor is raised typically, which comes in later with the mud flood. And actually, there are a lot of Chicago buildings that are this style due to the 1893 World's Fair that happened there. But we will get more into the World's Fair here in just a minute. Then all of a sudden, so you have all these beautiful buildings that are these like Beaux Art style, these like columns and these domes and this like gorgeous architecture, right? Very beautiful. And all of a sudden in the 19th century or like the 1800s-ish, like late 1800s, early 1900s, we started seeing just like plain Jane looking buildings that were like basically very square, very plain. Is the best way to say it. And that brought up a lot of questions. Like, why do we have all these beautiful buildings and great architecture, and then we just like stopped building these gorgeous buildings? And don't get me wrong, we didn't completely just stop. Obviously, they're still building different types of architectural buildings. But for the most part, they're not building as many of these buildings as they used to. Because we had better technology before. This is the answer to the question. We had better technology before with the Tartarians, but now the technology is gone and we don't know how to build beautiful buildings like that anymore. Basically is what the thought was at the time, like in the early 20th century, late 19th century. That was the thought. So as far as I can find, this like great mud flood occurred about 200 years ago and buried a lot of the advancements that had been made. So right around the time the architecture changed is when the mud flood happened, is basically what the theory what the theory is saying. So this is when other people started claiming these buildings that they had built, like that the buildings that were built by the Tartarians were actually like being claimed by other people. So like Joe Schmo down the road was like, oh, look at this beautiful building I built. But it was really like a Tartarian building. This is said to have been an attempt to wipe Tartarians from our history books. Although I have a theory later that I'm going to share that I think is it makes a little bit more sense to me, but it's not really necessarily like the actual theory found in the world. So this is also why during like the world wars, there was bombing raids over populated areas. It's said that this was like an attempt to destroy these buildings and erase like the Tartarian part of history, or like erase these buildings that were built by Tartarians being claimed that they were built by somebody else. They're trying to erase history, basically. So they bombed a bunch of buildings. They're like, get rid of history. We don't need it. It is also theorized that the World's Fairs were ways to like cover up the Tartarians' buildings. So you got World Wars, both of them, 1 and 2, where they're like, yep, let's bomb them, bomb these old buildings. We're covering up that history. Like, because this is, I mean, obviously pretty recent in recent history that all this was happening. And then also like the World's Fairs. So the idea is that these buildings that they put together for the World's Fairs were of the same architectural type. And everyone believed that these buildings were just kind of like thrown up for the fair. And when the fair was over, they would take down all these buildings and things and move out of town. Well, if the buildings at the fairs weren't just like thrown up, but were already there, this was like a convenient excuse for them to like tear down the buildings, thus further covering up the Tartarians. Because everybody believed like, oh, these buildings just like went up for the fair. So of course, when the fair leaves, they're going to take the buildings down. So it's a great way to demolish a building that when you're trying to cover up history. Yeah. So the mud flood that is said to have happened was around the world. It was a world mud flood. Like it happened everywhere. And it partially buried a lot of buildings. Not like, I mean, it was just like a couple feet of flooding. It wasn't like, I don't know, there wasn't like a whole lot of flooding. A couple feet. The reason for this is when you're looking at the architectural type, a lot of these buildings look to be partially buried, right? So you're looking at several of these buildings. They have a raised first floor, but you can kind of still see like the windows into the basement. They're saying like that's the partially buried part of the architectural type, but it was actually because of the mud flood. And they have dug out some of these buildings, and it does look like the first floor was buried. Was this like from the mud flood, or is that just like the architectural type that they just like they make the first floor a little bit higher? Because I mean, again, when you look up this architectural type, that's what it says, that it's a raised first floor. So I don't know. I'm just asking the question here. So the mud flood either occurred naturally, or another idea is that it occurred due to nuclear war. The reason the war makes more sense to me is because this entire race of people, technologically advanced people, right, were wiped out due to this mud flood. And if the flooding was only like a couple feet, which is kind of what I read, then why did the entire race of these like technologically advanced people get wiped out from this flood? Like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, we have flooding here now, and we don't die from it every time. I mean, don't get me wrong, some people die, but our entire species isn't wiped away because of this flood, or a flood. A lot of the theories here are talking about covering up history, but what if it was just like forgotten history? Like if this really did happen and it was just like forgotten history. So I'm kind of diving off the path of like the actual theories right now. I'm just kind of like speculating just myself, because this is what conspiracy theories are for, right? So what if Tartarians were in a war? Let's call it like a civil war. And if you are to be like one of the people that believe that it was the whole world is Tartaria, right? And so that's got a civil war around the world. Well, during this war, they blew themselves up so bad that it backtracked technology like decades, hundreds of years, let's call it, right? That makes more sense. And it wiped all these Tartarians out than just like some flood killed them. But it wasn't like a bad flood. It was just like a normal flood, a couple feet flood. That makes more sense to me. Then all the architecture and everything else was just here, and we just moved into it. We didn't really know the history of where it came from. And honestly, this would all make sense if we think about the Anunnaki being technologically advanced and teaching us some of their advancements. Because all of a sudden, like, we had this Anunnaki, if we're thinking about that theory, right? And they were here, they taught us all these things, and then all of a sudden we just didn't have any technology from them anymore. Like we're like, oh, we're good. We'll just throw it away and start over. Like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But Tartarians being like, or having that technology from the Anunnaki does make sense. And this would also make sense with like the electricity and the pyramids theory, which we're going to cover next week. So if you don't know what I'm talking about with that, come back next week, and because we're going to cover the whole like the pyramid theory. But if we start to think about this like that, then it could all make sense. And another like big thing is that a lot of these buildings had tall ceilings, like 10, 12-foot ceilings. Is that alluding to the fact that they were like taller or giants? Because the Anunnaki were giants when compared to us, and like we saw those pictures about the Anunnaki and how much larger they were than us, then it makes sense that the architecture would be taller. We would have taller ceilings because we have giant people living in them. I don't know. I mean, if you put it all like that, then this Tartarian thing kind of makes a little bit of sense. But it's kind of a far-fetched theory, in my opinion. You definitely have to do like a lot of what ifs in order to make it work. Or there are some other theories that like just kind of work naturally. But I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's kind of out there. I feel like I didn't cover it well enough because it was so hard to find the information. So if you have like more information about this, I can do like a follow-up episode to this one to like include more. But like I said, I feel like I did my best, but it was very convoluted and muddy to say the least. So it was a little bit of a shorter episode this week. But next week, like I said, we're going to cover the pyramids. That seems to be a really popular episode. Or theory, excuse me. I don't know if it's a popular episode. I haven't done it yet. But it seems to be a popular theory. And as always, I linked all my sources in the show notes. And until next time, my friends, stay skeptical, and I'll see you all then. Hey friends, The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast with everything you hear done by me, Danny Mercy. I appreciate all of your support. Please rate and review wherever you're listening. If you want to follow us on Instagram, it's at rabbit.holepodcast. And thank you, Zakar Valaha, for our awesome intro.